And it's always good to come out to the country. And when I look around here, I see there's a lot of faces that I've known from three months ago. And I did ask Bevan earlier on what I preached about 3 months ago, and he knew exactly what I was preaching about. So, and the title of today's or tonight's message is from Babakin to Sheva. And I know there's at least one lady here, apart from the ones I know, who knows where Babakin is. How many? Put your hands up, you know where Babakin is. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, okay. Now, just welcome the people from Geraldton that have just come in the door. Hi guys.
Thank you, Graham.
Welcome.
I thought we were on time, but...
Yeah, no, that's
anyway.
okay. That's okay. That's okay.
Country, doesn't matter.
And I was born in the Shire of Bruce Rock. And there is a lady here from Bruce Rock, I know that. And it's great to welcome you here tonight. And not only does she come from Bruce Rock, but she has got Jewish heritage. So that is fantastic. Now, Babakin is a very small town. At the moment, it's got 4 houses. And when I was in my prime, there was 5 houses. So it's got a town hall, it's got a school, and it's got a pavilion. So for us that are born in Babakin, there's no other place like Babakin. And in fact, at one time, and I think most of you people here would know this because I think most of the people here tonight are baby boomers. We had Senator George Branson, he came from Babakin, and also John Hallett, Jack Hallett. He was a member of the House of Representatives, lady over there nodding her head. He came from Babakin also. And so we had a thriving little community there in Babakin. In fact, it was the stop-off point for about 30 years as the tourists were coming back from Wave Rock. They used to stop in there for afternoon tea. And when they filled out the sheet when they got back to Perth, have a guess what was on the top? Babakin. Babakin was on the top. So I remember one day a Japanese lady said to me, because I used to go over and help my mother do the afternoon teas. I used to do all the washing up and the cleaning up, exactly what I'm doing today. But she said to me, "What do you do in Babakin?" And I told her what I did in Babakin. And you know what? There was only one day where I wasn't doing anything. You know, we're very, very much into the community and very much into sport. In fact, the 2 things that I can think of off the top of my head that stand out as far as Babakin goes is one, the Rhizanthella gardneri. Anyone know what that is? That's the underground orchid found in Babakin. Ah. And the other thing that is quite astounding, none of you would know this. One day we had a game of cricket at Babakin and the 11 players were all Crombies. All Crombies. There were 2 girls on the team, but you know, Babakin was way ahead of the times. We had women playing cricket 40 years ago in Babakin. We're way ahead of anywhere else in the world where they're just starting to get on with the fact that women can actually play cricket too. I had a great time at Babakin. It was just the most fantastic time, and I'm the eldest brother. And Kelvin, would you raise your hand? Kelvin was the youngest brother. I won't tell you how many years younger than me he is. And then there's a brother in between, his name is Clifton, and I've got an elder sister named Jeannie. So we were brought up on a farm, and it was a developing farm, and it was just a great place to live. We had 70 kids living or working or even attending the Babakin school. And you know, that was big because we were able to play a lot of sports and were able to have athletics and all the sort of things that everybody takes for granted. Anyhow, what happened was that one year Kelvin, he decided that he'd had enough of roustabouting and picking mallee roots and, you know, mainly getting ordered around by his older brother. I think that's what peeved him off more than anything else. And he went to Israel. And in fact, he went to Europe first, and then it got a little bit cold in England, so he finished up in Israel. And Kelvin loved Israel, and in fact, he made Israel his home. So Kelvin, would you just come forward and tell me a little bit about your time in Babakin, and just make sure you don't give your older brother a hard time.
I will make sure I give my older brother a hard time.
Yeah.
And he might not invite me back again. Yes, Grant said he's the older brother and I'm the youngest brother, so you all know what those dynamics mean. I won't go into any more details, but we had a great time on the farm in Babakin. Played a lot of sport, as Grant's already said, but because I'm the younger brother, by the time it got down to me, the quota had virtually been used up. And so I wasn't quite of the same ilk as they were. But when you grow up in the bush, there are things that you want to do. You want to be a good sports person. You want to be accepted. That's your bill of acceptance into the bush life. If you can play sport well, if you can be a real man, if you can shear 120 sheep a day, and all those sorts of things, then you sort of get elevated. And it's not the sort of a place for wimps or mummies boys and sooks, and that's really what I was called, because I didn't fit into the mould of what really makes up a bush boy. So as a young kid, I used to roam the bush. I used to go out, I used to know where the mallee hens used to be, and used to know where all the kangaroos used to hang out, where the wildflowers were. That was me. Mallee roots, no, he was telling a furphy. I was never so much into picking mallee roots. Any hard physical work, I left to them. But I used to do a lot of reading. As a kid, I had a strong desire to read books, and I used to read lots of books about the Second World War primarily, but also the First World War. And until today, I'm thankful for one person in particular that never stopped me, and that was my mother. Even though the rest of the family used to get quite irritated with me that I wouldn't do the hard work, and particularly my father, I won't tell you what he used to mention about me as far as work was concerned, but my mother never stopped me from reading books and doing all those sorts of things. And I'm glad she didn't, because she obviously recognised there was something that was there, latent, if you might say, and even though she didn't understand what it was all about, she, in a sense, she actually encouraged her. She encouraged the gift. And about the age of 5, I became interested in why Australian soldiers had served in the Middle East, and particularly in and around the land of Israel. I had 2 uncles that served there in the Second World War, and one of them died at Tobruk, and I was fascinated by this particular person. And actually, his name was John Crombie. I actually had my own library in our bedroom, and I called it the John Crombie Memorial Library. That's how crazy I was in those days about books and all that sort of stuff. But as a kid, I wanted to know why my uncles were there, why this man died at Tobruk, in general, why Australian soldiers were there. About the age of 5, I went with Dad down to a neighbour's farm. His name was Reg Clapp. He'd been in the 10th Light Horse. And I can still remember Dad saying to him at the break, he said, Reg, Kel's interested in the light horse. Please tell him all about it. I cannot remember Reg's answer, but I know that's what Dad actually asked him. And so my father also, in his own little way, sort of gave a bit of encouragement in this particular area, but he didn't give lots of encouragement because he had been a returned soldier himself and didn't like to speak about the military. That interest in Australia's military involvement in the Middle East continued to grow. Of course, the First World War, the Light Horse, and then the Second World War with Tobruk, Al Alamein, etc., etc. And of course, every Australian grows up, like New Zealander, with an interest in Gallipoli. So as I got older, I was reading more books about the subject matter, and it was the area of Israel and the Middle East began to really take my attention. And especially around the time, of course, of Anzac Day. In 1967, we had the 6-Day War. I was 10 years of age. My father had just come in from seeding. It was June. Listened to the ABC radio, and after hearing the news about what's happening in the Middle East, he said, well, Kel, looks like I might have to go back to fight again. And because Dad never made a comment about the conflicts or wars, etc., that was like a morsel of bread that fell from the table. And I became very interested. I actually used to have a cut-out book. Everything from the West Australian newspaper about war and conflict, I used to cut it out and paste it into this book. So all the details about the Six-Day War were cut out and pasted. Unbeknown to me at that time, my brother Grant was at Governor Stirling High School. He was a boarder at Swanlee. He had a history teacher whose name was Barry Kelvin. Okay, so you know what his heritage is, okay? Might be a relative, okay? Barry Cohen was his name, and Grant would tell us that every time during the period of the Six-Day War, he'd come in, he wouldn't worry about the curriculum, he'd get a big whiteboard or blackboard, and he'd write up there what was happening in the Middle East at that particular time. So that was Grant's introduction, you might say, to the Middle East. Unbeknown to me, across in South Africa, on a very, very remote mission station called Guyane, which is way up in northern, what was then called Transvaal, there was a young lady, her name was Lexi Rutgers. Her father was a mission doctor at a very remote mission station right up there. And Lexi had an auntie, an older auntie, a Dutch lady who came over in the middle of the night. There's no lighting out there in this particular place, and said something like, "Prophecy has been fulfilled today." It was at the time when Jerusalem had been captured in 1967. Lexi was 10 years of age, and she distinctly remembers that particular comment. So those are the things that were happening in my world, and also with Grant, and also with Lexi, who later became Mrs. Crombie, my wife. So in that same period of time, around the time of the Six-Day War, an Israeli family came to live in Babakin. Now, Grant didn't tell you, he did tell you the population of Babakin, but he didn't tell you how remote we were. It's between Bruce Rock and Corrigan. Now, when I tell the story overseas, I have to say to people, Babakin is a little tiny speck in Western Australia. Western Australia is a very big area. It's about the size of India. But in those days, our population was 1 million.
Oh, wow.
500,000 in Perth, which means 500,000 people spread through an area the size of India. Now, I was recently in the States and Canada, and I spoke on this subject on several occasions, and that really made people pay attention. An Israeli family came to live in Babakin to work on a farm for 2 years, the Fleischer family. Of all the places to come, it happened to be there. They came to my school, Babakin School. I collected postage stamps. I got all their postage stamps from Israel. So the interest in Israel continued to grow. We had an encyclopedia called The Purnell's History of the Second World War. I used to get it in weekly instalments. And on one occasion, the whole section was on Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. I'm 10, I'm 11 years old, and I'm reading this stuff, and it's just sinking in. And I still remember the photographs and the visuals. About the age of 11 or 12, we went to Corrigan, our local town, and every month we'd go in. I'd use my pocket money to get a football magazine in the winter and a cricket magazine in the summer. And I went in there and I saw a book called Treblinka. Now, Treblinka was the second most notorious of the death camps. As you know, there were 5 death camps. Many concentration camps, but 5 specific death camps to murder Jewish people as part of the Nazi desire to actually murder 11 million Jewish people, and the death camps were a big part of that process. So all I saw was this book called Treblinka in the Corrigan News Agency. I purchased that, and I didn't get my sports magazine. Now, what 11 or 12-year-old boy with no Jewish background whatsoever, with very, very small Christian heritage, what kid would go and do that? Would go and forfeit their sporting magazine pocket money to buy a book about Treblinka. So things were obviously happening, and there's more stuff as well. So at the age of 12, it was firmly established in my mind that Israel was important. So as I got older, that interest continued to grow, well, to an extent. When I got into my teenage years, of course, other things took over. The influence of my brothers, for instance, had a big, bearing. And I won't go into too many details, but overplaying sport. Again, it's a matter of trying to find your place in society. In the bush, you really had to be good at sport if you really wanted to be accepted in society. And that's where I was at the time. I had very little self-esteem. My self-esteem, my think about myself, I suppose, was gravitated about my ability to play good sport, etc., etc. So that remained with me throughout my teenage years. I went to Scottish College for 2 years and got into the football team and the cricket team and did all sorts of things there. And the interest in Israel went onto the back burner. When I finished high school, or finished at Scotch, I went in to play cricket and football, but of course when you're okay at schoolboy level, it's a different thing when you graduate into the adults level, and I didn't quite have it. Some people just go straight in, I didn't. And so I couldn't succeed in sport, so I began to sort of evaluate who I was. What's life all about? There must be something else to life. Well, there was. Then I got into the drinking and socialising and all that sort of stuff, and I was trying to find an answer to life, is probably the only way to put it, because sport wasn't fulfilling that expectation anymore. There was a big vacuum, a big void in my life. I was studying at the University of WA, and in 1976 something happened which transformed my thinking again. 1976, July 1976, any takers? Entebbe. The Entebbe raid, when the Israelis went into Entebbe in Uganda and rescued over 100 Jewish hostages who'd been taken there by a combination of different terrorists, primarily Palestinian terrorists. And so when that happened, Israel again came back onto the agenda as far as I was concerned. And so thereafter I just felt, no, I really want to go there. And as we get into 1977, 78, I began to realise that there has to be an answer to life, and that answer to life would be found in Israel. If you'd asked me then what that answer was, I couldn't have told you. But I just knew that the answer was actually in Israel. And so I pulled out of university in that period of time, much to my mother's disgust in a sense. She was, I was the last one that was actually going to make it, but no, I didn't. I pulled out. I went back to the farm. How are we going time-wise, Grant?
Oh, no, going good.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Look for...
I'll look for the time out. And so at that particular time when I went back to the farm, I went to the shearing team, rouseabouting. Frank Tilby was one of the guys, and used to be up in Crombie. We were talking today, and we realised that we had a mutual friend called Frank Tilby. He was my boss in the shearing team, so I saved enough money to go overseas, but the ultimate destiny was Israel. I knew that there was something waiting for me in Israel, but I didn't really know what it was. But first, I have to live life to the fullest. So a whole year in Europe. Now, what does a wild colonial boy get up to when he's in Europe for a whole year? I won't tell you. There was a little book over there. I got a few details in there. And so that was a whole year, but I was waiting to get to Israel. While I was in Europe, there was a couple of things I'd make sure I did every day. I'd make sure I had enough money for a local beer at the end of the day. And I'd always try to go to the cathedral, wherever I was. And wherever I used to go to see these cathedrals, that for me represented Christianity. It's not that I was interested in Christianity or Jesus, but somehow or other I just wanted to give it a go, you might say. After being in the Vatican, well, that was it. I ditched Christianity once and for all. I finally got to Israel in March of 79, still as a 21-year-old. And when the aeroplane landed at Tel Aviv airport, I had a shalom, I had a peace in my heart, which I can honestly say I'd never experienced before. I felt at home. It's uncanny. There's no reason for it. I'm not Jewish. I'm not from a practicing Christian background. But somehow or other, I felt, as we'd say in Hebrew, babayit, at home. By the end of that day, I was on a kibbutz, which is a collective farm on the very north of Israel, near the border of Lebanon and Syria. At that stage, the PLO was active and sending over Katyusha rockets, so not that many volunteers were going, but anyhow, that's where I actually ended up. So it was a wonderful period of time on the kibbutz. I felt very, very much at home. And I knew that answer to life was to be found in Israel. And the more I delved into it, the more I realised I want to become an Israeli. I felt accepted. I felt I didn't have to get runs on the board. I didn't have to get 5 goals in the football team. I just was accepted. So long as you worked hard, we used to drink a lot. There was about 5 or 6 Aussie guys. We made our own pub on the kibbutz, and that's a fact, okay? And so we played hard, but we also worked hard. It's a bit of an anomaly for me. My brothers still don't think I'm telling the truth here, but in actual fact, that was a fact. And so I felt very much at home there. I didn't have to do anything to be accepted. And so I felt this, I want to become an Israeli. So I left the kibbutz after a period of time, and I came back on a second occasion. And again, I wanted to live in Israel. In the meantime, I had met a Christian girl on the kibbutz on the first time. Nothing romantic there. This Christian girl from America went back and told her entire family about me, and they all began to pray and intercede for this wild colonial boy. Next thing, I had the pleasure just a few weeks ago to meet up with the remaining parts of the family in LA. I look upon them as being my spiritual parents in a way. And so when I came back the second time, I didn't realise this family was just praying and interceding for me. I went back to Israel the second time in 1980, determined to find the answer. What was it that had pulled me to Israel? What was this answer to life? And so at one particular point, when I was working with a guy called Yuval, he was one of the commandos on the Entebbe raid. He was actually my boss, and we got on quite well. I went to his wedding, actually. And so I had a number of people I emulated, and I wanted to become, in a sense, like them. I wanted to serve in the Israeli army and then be accepted fully into the society. But to do that, I was told I had to convert. So I thought, I'll convert. I'll convert to Judaism. So that was the next step. To be accepted fully, you convert, you go into the army. And then at one particular point, I was talking to a guy who was in the process of converting, and I realised, actually, I was reading his book he had to read from the rabbis, and I realised it's all about religion. You might say, well, dumbo, what do you think it's about? Well, I never stopped to think what's in the process of conversion to Judaism. And then I realised it's all about religion, and I was not interested one little bit in religion. And so I pulled out before I started the process. You see, for me, I wanted to identify with something, with somebody, with some entity. That's really what I wanted. I wanted, and you might say, acceptance. And I didn't think I was going to find that through Judaism. So at that point, when I pulled out, I had no plan B, and I just went down the gurgler, you might say. I just really sunk down low, and used to drink quite a bit, more than I should have. And this guy called Yuval, I was working with him one day, and he said, Kelvin, no, what's wrong with you? You used to be the life of the party. And he really gave me a challenge. And I thought, yeah, what is wrong with me? I don't know what's wrong with me. I just had no plan B. I wasn't going anywhere. But as it worked out, in that same period of time, a couple of new volunteers came to the kibbutz. One happened to be an American Christian girl from the same area that the family came from in LA, the family who's interceding for me. And this girl, on the very first day, I think it was, she was there, began to witness to me about Jesus. And I said, I don't want to hear about this Jesus. I'm not interested in Jesus. If there is a God, he's the God of Israel and the Jewish people. You Christians are all wrong. You're all hypocrites. That was it. I've been to the Babakin, said I to her. Not interested in Christianity, in Jesus. You see, I was looking at Jesus through the lens of the church, the lens of Christianity. Instead of looking at Jesus, who he is. And so that was it. And she began to intercede. Well, thankfully she did. Because just a short period later, I went with this particular lady and some other volunteers from the kibbutz. We went to Jerusalem for Easter. In 1981, Easter and Passover fell at the same time. And we went to a place called the Garden Tomb for the Easter Sunday morning service. And there was an Anglican priest who was speaking that day. What did I see when I saw an Anglican priest up there? A guy with a dog collar.
Dog collar.
Anyhow, it just so happened that he preached a message that turned my life inside out, upside down and around. He spoke about Jesus being a Jew. I must have heard that at some stage. This was my epiphany. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus was the Passover lamb, and the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel would precede the return of Jesus. Well, the return of Jesus to Jerusalem. And so until that particular time, it was always an either-or situation. This Anglican minister was actually bringing it both together. It's not an either-or, it's a both and. That was my epiphany. And 3 months later, while in the UK, I repented and had a very dramatic born-again experience. My life was turned upside down and inside out. And so at that particular point, after I became a follower of Jesus, I came back to Jerusalem. And on that occasion, or just before I came back, I was working on a farm in England. I'd been sort of in between going to Israel. I was working in a farm in England to save money. And on one particular occasion, just before I came back, there was a New Zealand lady that was working there. Her name was Jill Squire. So when I came back to Israel towards the end of 1981 as a newborn Christian for my third visit there, one of the people that came back with me was a New Zealand lady, and her name was Jill, and later she became the wife of Grant. So I'll finish my little story there.
Thank you, Kelvin. And what was happening to me at that time was that I decided that wasn't all about farming. So what happened was I went to Kalgoorlie to work for Vickers Keogh, and I had a girlfriend at that time, and she just happened to be going to Melbourne. So on the platform, the railway platform at Kalgoorlie, I proposed to her. What a great place to propose to a lady on the railway platform.
See you later.
And she said yes. So I was living with a Catholic family, and like all Catholic families, they go to church on Sunday, and I used to go along. And I remember one night, vividly, I woke up, and this voice said to me, "You will not marry this girl.
Wow.
You will go to Jerusalem and Julia." And okay, so I kept it to myself because I didn't want to be known as a nutter. But it just so happened that one of Jill's friends and Kelvin's friends came to work on my farm. And Shmulik Benozio, we used to call him Honda because he had a Honda t-shirt. And he said to me, "Do you think that you'll ever come to Jerusalem?" And I told him the story. And he just shook his head and thought, a nutter. Anyhow, so as time progressed, we're going to jump from 1975 to 1984. And we got a message. It was kind of like a revelation from heaven that Kelvin had found someone that would marry him. So what happened was that I put up my hand and I said, "Well, I'll go and represent the Crombies." So I packed up my bags and headed off over to Jerusalem. Fortunately, Mum was coming later, and so was Uncle Jim. But Kelvin here is the youngest brother. You just got to be very, very aware of him because he sets things up. And what he did, he got me a job at an Arab community centre, and also he got all of his friends to start praying that Grant would come to know the Lord. And we lived in a great little place over on Melchizedek Street, and it was an Arab village. And another thing that he did was that there was an American lady, and she was Afro-American. She ought to be looking for somebody to come running with her. So I got dobbed in there. So I used to go running through this Arab village, and all the Arabs would yell out, "Yehudi, Yehudi." They thought we were Jewish. Anyhow, so what happened was that Arab Community Centre, I love working there, that most of the people there were Arab Christians. There were a few Muslims there, but you know what, they weren't radical. And I really enjoyed my time there. And I remember once there was a girl called Sanaa, and she lived in Nazareth. And she said, "Oh, why don't you come up and meet my family?" And I thought, "Oh, okay." And went home and told Kelvin, and he said, "No, don't go there, because that's like she wants to marry you." So I pulled out of that one. But this lady called Sanaa, I said to her one day, "Look, we're having a speaker coming to the International Christian Embassy. Would you like to come along?" She said, "Oh, yeah, okay, come along." So Johann von Lockhoff was speaking, and he was speaking about the Jews being God's chosen people. And afterwards, we went to a coffee shop and sat down there, and I said, "Sanaa, what did you think of that?" And she said, "That was total rubbish. The Jews are not God's chosen people. We are, the Arabs." So, I mean, I was a non-believer, and here I was trying to tell her the truth. anyhow, so what happened was we argued for so long that I missed the bus going up to her house. So I had to walk her up to the Mount of Olives. And lo and behold, we got up there to her flat and her sister was there. So I had to try and explain to the sister that the Jews were God's chosen people. She wouldn't have anything to do with it. So I said good night to the girls and I went outside. I was looking down over Jerusalem. The lights were on, the whole city. And I said, Lord, I think you want me to come into the kingdom. And I heard a voice that said, yes, Grant. I looked over. I thought that Jesus was standing right next to me. And it wasn't until later on I realised that Jesus and God are spirit. And I just had a sense. So what I did when I went down, back down to the unit, and it took me a long time to get down there, and when I got there, Kelvin was in his sleeping bag, and I said, Kelvin, you awake? And he said, yeah. I said, I want you to baptise me in 2 weeks' time. He couldn't get out of his sleeping bag quick enough. He was that excited. And you know, Kelvin is often right about most things, but one thing he was totally wrong about was the fact that I wanted to get baptised in the pool of Siloam. And he said, no, there's no chance you'll get baptised there because that's Muslim country. And I said, oh yeah. But you know, most of my friends were all volunteers and they had no money. So what happened was I got baptised in the pool of Siloam on Resurrection Sunday, and beforehand we'd been to the resurrection breakfast, and this lady came up to Kelvin and said, I believe Grant's getting baptised today, can I come, you know, get baptised too? And Kelvin said, yeah, I think that's okay. So after we all got baptised, we went up to one of the units and we're all having a cup of tea and a few biscuits. Kelvin came over and he said, look, I want you to give your testimony. Oh, okay. So what I did, I went back to that day in Kalgoorlie. And I said, you know what, I didn't marry that girl. And I said, here I am in Jerusalem. But I said, who's Julia? And the lady that got baptised with me, she put up her hand and said, my name is Julia. I thought, wow, righto, gee, I'm full on for the Lord here. So I got, not only did I get born again, I got baptised in the pool of Siloam, and that dream came true that I'd had in 1975. I'm not going to take up too much more time, Kelvin, so you get your last part organised. And so what happened was I went back to Corrigan, and I went back to a totally fundamental Church of Christ. You know, they even looked unkindly at people clapping hands during the worship time, you know, things like that. And what happened was that just for a little bit of excitement, I used to go to down to New Day Ministry down in Perth. Who remembers New Day? You know, totally Pentecostal. You know, it was a great place to be. I see Martin put his hand up there, so I went there. And, you know, certain things happened which were kind of a bit way out, but, you know, I just continued to grow in the Lord. And there was something very special happened there. I think the most special thing that happened there was that we all got on board with Yonggi Cho. Who remembers Yonggi Cho? Where when you prayed for things, you became pregnant with them. And we had a great little fellowship, but the one thing we did not have an organist. So we got very specific about who was going to come and be our organist. She had to be female, all right? Had to be female. And she had to be a good organist or pianist, and she had to stay for a while. So
This is in Corrigan you're talking
in
about,
Corrigan,
not
in
you.
Corrigan, back in Corrigan. And so we all got down to some really serious prayer on this. And we were all serious about it because Yonggi Cho was very committed to the way you prayed. You had to be pregnant with this organist. You know, that's the way we prayed. And we had to have this by the long weekend in March. Okay, so as time got closer, we're all thinking, oh, Jesus, I don't think it's going to happen. Anyhow, so we're all a bit dubious, but we had to stick to prayer. So guess what happened on the first weekend in March? Jill came along. decided to drop in and see Grant at Babakin on the way home to New Zealand. Just so happened that Kelvin and Lexi were back in Babakin at that time. And so Jill came along to the church on Sunday, and we're all discussing about, you know, this is the day that our prayers are answered. Guess what? Jill can play the organ.
Wow.
So what a great answer to prayer that was, eh? What a great answer to prayer. So, you know, I was full on for the Lord, and it was a very small church, and when you're in a small church you get, you know, responsibilities. And I think I'd only been an elder for about 6 months, and I'd become a deacon, and I think after 12 months I was an elder, and then the pastor left, so I became the pastor. So I wasn't much of a pastor, but you know, in a small church, what do you need? You need community, don't you? You need people to work in together. And one of the things that always fascinated me about Kelvin was he was really stuck on the army. And I just want Kelvin to come back and just tell us a story about how he got involved with the Light Horsemen. Anything you want to say nice about Lexi, this could be the time, Kelvin. And also talk about back to Beersheba and the charge of Beersheba.
Hard act to follow, isn't he? So, well, a nice thing to say about Lexi is that when I came back to Israel in end of 81 as a new Christian, I went to work in a hospital for physically handicapped Arab and Jewish children. Never worked in that environment before, and had a whole year working as a volunteer in this institution, and I would still say it's one of the most incredibly significant periods of my entire life, because the Lord is sovereign over our lives. God has a destiny for each and every one of us, and He often puts us in places where at the time we don't understand, but later we do have a better comprehension of why He put us there. So until this time, my exposure to Israel being primarily with Jewish people. I didn't have much contact with Arabic-speaking people. But in this place, I had a lot of contact with the Arabic-speaking young folks, adults. Oftentimes they were neglected, and many times I would actually take them out. I'd take them on excursions, even take them back to visit their families, because often people wouldn't come to visit them. And then, shortly afterwards, I began to work in a psychiatric and geriatric hospital. I said, work, because often when I say it, people say, you were there as a patient or as a worker. No, I was working as a nurse's aide in the psychiatric and geriatric hospital, and that's where I met Lexi. Lexi was a nurse. In 1981, she'd come to Israel as a committed Christian to work amongst the Jewish people within Dutch-based ministry. In that same period of time, I went to live in Silwan, which is a Muslim Arab village. It's actually the city of David. Okay, Silwan, Silwan in Hebrew you might say, or Shiloach, and Silwan in Arabic. That's the Muslim village I was living in for about 3 years, and that's where Grant came. And again, part of God's sovereignty, because here I was now living full-time in a Muslim Arab village. My landlord was a Muslim man whom I had great respect for. And so it's part of God's overall strategy sometimes, or working in my life at that particular time. And I'll get to that again in a minute. Lex and I were married in 1984. We were attending the local Baptist church, which was a Baptist church, but because Lexi and I both had to work on Saturdays, and that's when the church would meet, to work on Saturdays as a Gentile in Israel, because the religious Jewish people won't work on Shabbat on Saturdays, so we worked. So we couldn't go to our local church together, but we were going oftentimes on Sunday to the local Anglican church. It's an evangelical Anglican church called Christ Church. And so it's very interesting that when I became a new Christian, I went back to Israel, I went in to visit this church, and the minister was the same man who had spoken at the Garden Tomb several years before, whose message had dramatically affected my life. And so he was the minister of the church. His name was David Price. And so Lexi and I then in 84 began to attend that church. A new minister had just come in called Alfred Sawyer, an American man. And he was looking for somebody younger who he could, in a sense, develop. And that happened to be me. And so I was then prepared by Alfred. He wanted me to go all the way through, but I said no. I'm coming to this congregation not because I think I have to become an Anglican, but because we feel this is a community we want to become part of. As it worked out, in time I went through, I was the committee member, the warden, and then came onto staff in 1986 as the guide, evangelist and historian and researcher. So all the things that I was interested in as a kid, I now could actually do, and I was getting paid for it. I hadn't been paid anything. I've been in Israel now 5 years as a volunteer, so now I was getting a salary, which is very nice because we just had our first child in the same month I began working there. So Lexi was a nurse, she didn't get a bank role anymore. And so when I started to work at Christ Church as an evangelical Anglican church as the guide, my role was to study and to then speak about the role of the British and the Protestants in the Middle East in the modern period. That's what I actually had to speak on, to visiting Israel, primarily Israeli and other groups. That was the subject matter, because Christ Church, as an Anglican church, was the first Protestant church in the Middle East, the first modern building in Jerusalem, and those who established the centre there actually established the first hospitals and schools, etc., etc. So that little area inside the old city of Jerusalem represented the beginning point of Western influence in the land of Israel. And so it was my task to speak on this subject matter to all these academic groups who were coming in, so I had to study. And so all those subjects that I was interested in as a kid, when I began to read about them, they began to make some sense. When I was looking at the role of the British in the region, it started with 1798, Napoleon's invasion of the region, ended in 1948 when Britain left and the State of Israel was established. A neat 150-year period. So when you're looking at the history of the British in that particular region, you come to the First World War, you come to the Second World War. Well, who happened to parachute into the region in the First and Second World Wars but the Anzacs? Now, when I used to learn about the Anzacs back here in Australia, you almost felt as if we were the only ones at Gallipoli. Okay? Well, you almost felt that we were, the Brits relied upon us because you don't hear about the involvement of too many others. Well, now I'm actually looking at the bigger context and I realise that we were actually fitting into a much bigger picture. And that was very, very helpful. And so as a result of doing this historical research, and I had the British involvement from 1798 onwards, we come to the First World War, we come to Gallipoli. And I began to read stuff about the bigger picture concerning Gallipoli and how in actual fact it was the beginning point of the road that ultimately led to Jerusalem. And I wrote a book on that several years ago called Gallipoli, the Road to Jerusalem. And in actual fact, that is the way it panned out, both militarily and politically, but we won't go into those details today. As you start to look at the First World War and the involvement of the British in that region, then you start to look at the light horse. And so now, rather than the light horse being just people that were on a next door neighbours, Reg Clapton, and others you learnt about when you're growing up, now the light horse were part of a much bigger picture. And it all just the dots began to join, so to speak. And so by this stage, I knew about Gaza. Okay, I knew that we'd been involved twice in battles of Gaza and were defeated. I'd gone to Beersheba on several occasions. Okay, Beersheba for English-speaking ears, but also Beersheva. One gentleman's already reminded me that the best way to pronounce Beersheba is Beersheba. There you go. Okay, and I've been to Jerusalem, and I'd been to many of the places that were associated with the light horse. Now, when I brought Lexi back in 1985, okay, and that was the excuse that Jill had in order to come and meet up with Grant again, because she came to be here when we were here. Is that about right, Jill? Yeah, okay. Well, on that particular visit, I brought Lexi back for the first time. We were at Narrogin. We stopped at Narrogin on the way back from Albany. And there's a wonderful war memorial in Narrogin. And around the top of the war memorial were the names of places associated with the Anzac soldiers. Gaza, Jerusalem, Sea of Galilee, Damascus. And Lexi looked at those and she knew those names, familiar with them. She said, what are those names doing here in a Western Australian country town? It's because they were the places where the light horse had served. And so these things were beginning to sort of fall together for me within the bigger context of my historical research in Jerusalem at Christ Church, in order for me to begin to speak on the subject matter to the visiting groups. So it was in that context I began to see the light horse in a completely different viewpoint, you might say. In 1988, I remember I took my first tour down to Sheva. It was Lexi, there was a Sri Lankan lady, a Dutch lady, and our two youngest daughters. I put them into the car, and I said, we're going down to Sheva today, and I'm going to tell you how it was captured by the light horse, or something like that. So that was my first tour. And that was the first and only tour that was taking place in those years related to the light horse in the land of Israel. So that was a pioneering thing. Thereafter, I began to do it once every 2 weeks to different people. When I became the manager of the Christchurch guest house in 1990, as the manager, I had lots of people who were staying in the guest house. They were always saying, Kelvin, what can we do today? I said, oh, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do today. We'll take a tour down to Sheva. You pay for the fuel, you pay for my lunch, voila, we're on a winner. And so sometimes it was once a week. I'd take visitors primarily in the guest house and others as well. The next thing I know, tour groups are hearing about it. Next thing, the Australian Embassy hears about it. So next thing I know, I'm being asked by the Australian Embassy to take visiting trade delegations, military delegations, and political delegations. There's a whole who's who of people I've actually done tours with or given presentations to. So things now began to develop. Who would ever have thought that some years before, that you get to this particular point? But the most interesting thing for me was all those matters that had interested me as a kid now actually began to fall into place. You know, when Jerusalem was captured on the 9th of December 1917, there was only one Anzac unit involved in the capture of Jerusalem. That was the 10th Light Horse from Western Australia. You might have seen the famous photograph of General Allenby there with soldiers in front of him. Well, that photograph was taken from the roof of Christchurch. And so there's this incredible symbiotic relationship between Christchurch and all those military components. Second World War. What had triggered my interest in the first place? Uncle John at Cherok, okay? And then El Alamein. So little did I know then that the Battle of El Alamein and the involvement of the Anzac soldiers in the Middle East was vitally important for the safety and security and well-being of Jewish people. Because in that period of time, in January 1942, the Nazis had made a decision at Wannsee House near Berlin to murder 11 million Jewish people. And part of that plan meant murdering all Jewish people who lived in the land of Israel, all 500,000 of them. And so as a result of that, they sent a murder squad to the Middle East, and that murder squad was to come in behind Rommel's forces. And when the Germans had defeated the Allies, the British, Australians, New Zealanders at El Alamein, then the murder squad would join with local collaborators and begin to murder all the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Now, I wasn't aware of that as a kid growing up with an interest in Cherok and El Alamein, but now it began to sort of make sense. The dots were joining. And it just so happens that the Jewish leadership in 1946 gave Field Marshal Montgomery a gift of gratitude. Montgomery was the commander of the Allied forces. That gift of gratitude was a little Bible, a Hebrew Bible with silver and pearl on the outside. Well, I heard from an Israeli professor, Alex Carmel, that about the existence of this Bible, and he said, Kelvin, you work with this organisation, see if you can find it, because he had a sense it belonged to CMJ, the organisation that I worked with. And lo and behold, I went to England. I used to go to England to the head office every now and again and bring stuff back. We established a museum. And on one occasion, I asked a staff member about the existence of this Bible. And nobody knew about it. But one person said, hang on, I seem to recall seeing something once in a cupboard, right down the very back. We found it, tucked away at the back of a filing cabinet. And there was the Bible given by the Jewish leadership to Montgomery after the victory at El Alamein. The words that went with it were powerful. To Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, the gallant leader of the victorious British forces, by whose hand God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein. So our soldiers, as part of the Light Horse, were involved in liberating the land in the First World War from Muslim Turkish occupation, so that the Jewish people could come back. And in the Second World War, our soldiers were instrumental in helping to save the lives of 500,000 Jewish people from being murdered by the Nazis. Okay? And that lays the foundation for the establishment of the State of Israel. So all these dots were now beginning to join. Now we'll jump over, I think I've got about 5 minutes left. We jump over a few years until the year 2006 or thereabouts, and by this stage I had conducted dozens of light horse tours. It could be up into 100, I can't remember. But there were lots and lots of these light horse tours I've been doing. I'd already written on the subject matter by that stage. And I felt that with the 90th anniversary coming up in 2007, we needed to do something special. I won't go into all the details, but I, by this stage, met a man called Barry Rogers, who was a director of the Australian Light Horse Association. And as it worked out, Barry and myself and a few Israelis put our heads together and we decided we'd do a reenactment of the charge at Beersheba. That was in 2007. We had 50 riders, 70 people in the tour, 50 riders came over, and it was an incredible, incredible event to do the reenactment itself. And then we had a procession on horseback through the streets of Beersheba beforehand, and it was on all the media. And even TV stations in Russia had stuff about this reenactment of the light horse at Beersheba in 2007. So I guess in many ways that was a high point. What started off with just taking Lexi and a few other people in my own car down to Beersheba had grown to this particular point. We did another one in 2012, and then in 2017 we had the big event of 100 riders. Grant came over, not as a rider, but as an attendee on that occasion. And I had the great honour of being asked to actually give the historical presentation at the place where we had the reenactment in 2017. So that, in a sense, brought things around to some sort of a completion. But there was another event a few days later, the Royal Albert Hall in London, where I again was asked to give a presentation on Beersheba and Balfour. Okay, it's the Balfour Declaration, the British government's decision to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, happened at the same time as the Battle of Beersheba. We had a massive event in the Royal Albert Hall, and I was asked to give the presentation there as well. So in many ways, it was sort of like it just brought things around to a completion. And what began at Babakin, in a sense, was now coming to some sort of a completion. And after that event had concluded, and I'm going to conclude very, very soon, Graham.
That's right.
After that event had happened, there's not very often that a boy from Babakin gets the opportunity of giving a historical presentation in the Royal Albert Hall. So the chances of that happening again are pretty remote. And so you want to soak it a little bit. And I remember afterwards, I was walking back to a taxi to go back to the hotel, and it was like Grant in Kalgoorlie. I virtually heard a voice. And it was almost like somebody's tapping me on the shoulder. And the voice said something like this: "That's it, Kelvin, job done."
Oh, well done.
Okay, that's it, job done. And as much as I wanted to revel in the limelight, you might say, I just knew what it was all about. I knew the Lord was just saying to me, my job had been done. And it did wrap up. And then I went on, I was asked to do research on what happened to the Jewish Christians in the Holocaust, which is what I've been working on in the last 5 years. But I'll finish up with this one last note, because this was 2017, and I just felt the Lord just saying, that's it, end of one thing, and I'm leading you into something else. But there was another thing which happened in 2018, and that was the unveiling of a very special statue at Tzemach on the southern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That statue is a statue of an Aboriginal light horseman. And as far as I'm aware, there's no other statue of its kind. And that initiative was my initiative. Many years before, we'd been talking about doing something, and I had a strong sense there had to be a statue of an Australian light horseman on the Sea of Galilee, at a place where there were Australian light horsemen involved. And that was in Tzemach, in the southern part of the Sea of Galilee. And so it had just so happened that some years before we had discovered that we actually are part Aboriginal, part of our heritage is Aboriginal. It was hidden from us. We were told we were part Indian. And so it came to light when I was doing some research and discovered that one of our grandfather's brothers had served in the First World War as a part Aboriginal soldier. That's how it all began to unravel. So when we get to this period of time when we were developing things in Israel, and I had the sense there had to be a statue of an Australian light horseman. Barry Rogers is the head of one of the directors of the Light Horse Association. Barry really began to be interested in this. But how are we going to get something like that done? And it's not a small thing to get. We were involved in the museum at Beersheba, and now involved in something at Semach on the Sea of Galilee. But to do something like this, it's going to entail a lot of work. Well, it just so happened that there was a man called Ken Wyatt, had just recently come into Parliament as a Western Australian member of the House of Representatives, and Ken came from Corrigan. Okay, I'd gone to school with his siblings. Grant had gone to school also with Ken at Swan Lee. And so we felt Ken was the one to turn to. So I had a meeting with Ken in Parliament House in Canberra, and I walked in. I mean, it must have been 40, 50 years since I'd seen Ken, and I didn't have much contact with him. We walked in, and his first words to me were, "How you going, cuz?" And my words back to him, "Well, good, cuz." Okay? He knew that we were related, okay? Not by blood, but through marriage, okay? And he knew all about where those relationships actually were forged. And so we sat down, and we had a receptive audience. We gave the vision of having a statue of an Australian Aboriginal light horseman on the Sea of Galilee. And so again, this was, I can't remember what year this was, but we were actually able then to get this whole project off the ground. Barry Rogers then sort of, in a sense, took it on. Another one of those situations where I felt my job had been done and I backed off. So I was given an invitation to go to the unveiling in 2018, and I didn't go because I felt by this stage my job had been done and began to work in other subjects. So I just want to conclude by saying that God doesn't waste anything.
No.
When you start talking about recycling, God is the most wonderful recycling agent there is. We may look at our lives and look at things which happened many, many years ago, and we think there's no relevance in that. In actual fact, God can use everything. And I look back at my life and see all these little stepping stones, all these things which happened in bygone years, and the Lord has recycled them, and He's redeemed them, and He's able to use them. The big problem is, are we willing to let God recycle us and reuse us, in a sense? And that's the story. It's the story of redemption. I was redeemed, and thank goodness I was. I was going down the gurgler. I was going down into a big pit. When the Lord brought me out and put me onto a firm platform, all those things that had interested me as a kid, in time, came into focus, and He was able to use it, but for the purposes of redemption. And so if there's anybody that's here today that's struggling with their identity, struggling with their lives, struggling with purpose, let me please assure you, in the eyes of God, each and every one of you is precious. And God desires for each and every one of us to be redeemed and used for His kingdom purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin. As the older brother, I just want to conclude. And I'm just going to tell you one little story. It's when Kelvin was not available and Big Brother stepped in. And it just so happened that I had another dream only a couple of years ago. And the story of the dream was, "You shall go to Narrabeen and preach the gospel." And I woke up and I said, "Lord, if you want me to go to Narrabeen and preach the gospel, you have to do the organising." So, just so happened that last year, a dear lady from Narrabeen passed away. And you know what? She loved the Crombie boys, but in particular she liked Kelvin. I can never understand why, but she liked Kelvin. So what happened was, she wanted Kelvin to do the funeral. And unfortunately they found out Kelvin was in Scotland. So Deanne, the daughter, thought about it, and what about Grant? So I got a phone call to go to Narrabeen to do a funeral. And I thought, oh, I'm going to really give it to him. And look, it was fantastic, because a lot of those people at the funeral were all the guys I played cricket against, tennis against, football against, badminton against, squash against. And I thought, well, Lord, I don't think you're going to send me back. So I had the opportunity to take Kelvin's place and preach the gospel in Narrabeen. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And if you want a second serve, I'm preaching here at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you.
Nothing like sibling rivalry, is there? Absolutely nothing. And they were testing it out this afternoon at our place, so it was a good thing. They did say they're happy to take any questions, so if you've got any questions...
In the coffee time.
Oh, in the coffee time, okay. So we're going to have fellowship now, there'll be tea, then there's some things to have a snack on. And if you want to, you can bail them up and have a chat. And I think there's lots of material over there as well. Do you want us to talk about any of that before we...
It's quite self-explanatory. There's various books on different subjects, and my wife Lexi will be there to answer any questions you have. Yes, dear?
I think she's trying to hide that.
Humble young lady.
Okay, thank you very much. Feel free to mingle, have a tea or a coffee, and there's some light refreshments there, and enjoy your time with us. Thank you.